right, thank you, Tyler. Well, good morning. Good to be in worship with you as always, praising our great God. Today is Senior Sunday, so today is a special day where we want to honor those who are graduating in this crazy year, crazy time to be graduating, I suppose, but we want to honor them. Jordan's going to have some things to say about that at the end of our service today, so we will do that here in just a little while. But every time we have a Senior Sunday, it seems that someone makes the comment to me as we're looking at the booths out there, it won't be long until, one of yours is going to be doing this. And it never fails. Every year somebody says something to that effect, and it is true. I get it. Time is flying by already, and I can feel it. I can feel it. Sophia, my oldest, had her birthday yesterday. She turned 8 yesterday, and we were talking to my mom, her Nana, on the phone, actually on FaceTime, and Nana said that it's only going to be 5 years until Sophia becomes a teenager. And I was like, great, thanks for that, Mom. It's like, and so Sam, my youngest, is 5, and so I'm like, she's only a Sam away from being a teenager, and that sort of blows my mind and makes me a little bit nervous. But hey, that's just the way the life goes, I suppose. But anytime we're thinking about that sort of stuff, it gets us thinking about the future and sort of the hopes that we have for our kids. And, we think about the seniors as they graduate and as they leave to go do other things, and as we look to our kids that are eventually going to be moving into that, we think about their future and we think about the hope that we have for them. And among the things that we hope for, we of course we hope that they have some sort of success in life. Whatever it is, whatever path that they choose to do, we hope for them some sort of success among other things. But maybe we should ask ourselves, what does success look like? What is really success when we think about it, especially from a perspective of faith? What does success in our faith life look like? Can we expect the same thing that we do for other things? We want to make sure that we are after a godly kind of success rather than a worldly definition of success. We have been going through a series on Acts. We are about halfway through the book of Acts now, and coming up on this, we're going to be thinking about now the success that we might expect in going through this book. It's the story of the launching and the building of God's unstoppable church. It is the story of unlikely characters doing unlikely things in unlikely places by God's power. Last week, we saw Paul and Barnabas, along with John Mark, go off on the very first missionary journey. And now that the church has started to get to a point where it's branching out from where it all started, and they're sending off Paul and Barnabas. And they start in Barnabas' hometown on the island of Cyprus, and they experience some things there that we talked about last week. This is the island of Cyprus where the missionary journey all began. They traveled across that island, and you recall they ran into the Jewish magician and the things that happened there, and converted, or at least got Sergius Paulus to believe in the message that they had to present. Well, they leave out of here from Paphos on the west side of the island, the capital of this island, and they move north to go into the mainland here. This is Asia Minor. It is what is modern-day Turkey, and so they sail into the southern part of it here, and they go up to the very bottom of that line there is Perga, and when they get to Perga, John Mark, for reasons that Luke doesn't tell us, decides to turn back. He ends up going back to Jerusalem, and Paul and Barnabas continue on the journey on their own. And they work their way up to the north to Antioch. Now, this is a different Antioch from the other Antioch. The other Antioch was in Syria. This is in a region called Pisidia. There's a lot of cities that had the name Antioch, and if you think about it, that's not uncommon. There are cities across the United States that share the same name. It's not that unusual. So they go up to Antioch and they start to, convert, have some success there at getting some people to come and hear the word. And they are following the pattern there of going and preaching in the synagogues, just as we saw them do on the island of Cyprus, and then branching out from there. And they go from Antioch over here to the east, over to Iconium and Lystra and Derbe. That green part of the map right here, Lystra, that's where we're going to be spending most of our time today. Just so you kind of know where we are. But they are going and speaking, and people are starting to become interested in what they have to say. And we get this right at the end of Acts chapter 13. As they went out, the people begged that these things might be told to them the next Sabbath. Now, this is happening right after Paul has been preaching in the synagogue, and after he finishes up, they're like, you got to come back next week and tell us more. Okay? And after the meeting of the synagogue broke up, many Jews and devout converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas, who, as they spoke with them, urged them to continue in the grace of God. The next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. That's pretty incredible, right? This is looking pretty good for Paul and Barnabas. And what happens right after that is there's some other people that are some vocal opponents that show up and cause a little bit of division within this group. But if we go on from there, I thought I had another verse up there. Well, anyways, they continue to have some success in converting or gathering up these crowds of people. And so we start to see they have all of these excited. Is it the next one? Oh, I got these. Nope, not that one. Okay. Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay. Sorry about that. All right, so anyways, they have some success at gathering up these crowds, even though they have some vocal opponents amidst all of these crowds. There are people that are interested, people that are taking hold of this message that they have to present about the gospel. Paul is somebody who knows how to capitalize on a crowd. And we'll see that several times through the story. He knows how to capitalize on a crowd. Excited crowds are a great opportunity. Excited crowds are something that we want to see. We get excited about seeing excited crowds. It presents us with a great opportunity. And churches are often focused on creating just that scenario, on getting together a group of people that we could call a crowd and having them be really excited. A lot of times that is our focus. In fact, when you get church leaders together from different congregations, often what do they start talking about is, how many do you have coming to your church? And so we start comparing. We start measuring ourselves in some ways that way. And we realize this is one measure, one thing that we can look to. But just because there are a lot of people doesn't mean that all is well. Just because there are a lot of people doesn't mean that all is well. Excited crowds are a great opportunity, but we must look beyond that. To see what happens as Paul starts to gather these crowds, we go with him down the road onto Lystra here. And when they get to Lystra, Paul is teaching and preaching, and in the midst of the crowd, he sees somebody that cannot walk. And much like Peter did long ago in this series, he heals him and causes him to be able to walk. And after doing this, verse 11, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the local language, Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gate and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. There was a great crowd. Paul had gathered a great crowd to hear this teaching and to see the power of the Lord be shown. But all was not well in this crowd. This is a strange, almost, if it weren't so serious, almost comical event that happens here. Because they're speaking in a language that Paul doesn't speak. This is a regional language, Lycaonian. Paul would be speaking in Greek, and they would have known Greek as a second language, but their first language is this. And so they're talking, and Paul at first doesn't know what they're talking about. It's going to dawn on him in a minute what's happening. But they're like, wow, something amazing is happening. Zeus and Hermes must have shown up. Why do they think Zeus and Hermes are there? Well, that's because there is a local legend in this region that is from Greek mythology, that in this area there's a story about Zeus and about Hermes coming to the area disguised as mortals and traveling into the city and finding that no one welcomed them except for one old couple named Bacchus and Philemon. This couple welcomed them and made them a meal, even in their humble house there. They provided for them, and then it was revealed that it was Zeus and Hermes, and they were rewarded while the rest of the city was destroyed. That's the story that comes from this region. And so when Paul and Barnabas show up, and this miracle happens, it's like it clicks in their head like, oh, it's happening again. The legend that we've heard, it's happening, and so they want to make sure that the city doesn't get destroyed. And so they want to be sure to offer the honor that they think is due in this region. Excited crowds are a great opportunity, but a poor measure of success. And so I said, how do we know, what do we look at, how do we measure success? Just because there's a lot of excited people does not equal success. Because that's what we have in this story. We have excited people who are seeking to give the best honor they can think of to God's people. They are witnessing the power of God and honoring it as power, and yet it is misguided. They're seeking to honor Paul and Barnabas. And I believe that right here, we're being told a story about Satan presenting a powerful temptation to Paul and Barnabas. Very, I think, similar. The circumstances are different, but similar to the temptation of Jesus. When Jesus is taken into the wilderness and Satan takes him to the pinnacle of the temple and he says, throw yourself off. People will think it's amazing. And you'll draw a crowd. That's the temptation. You'll draw a crowd and people will come and think you are spectacular for all the wrong reasons. And I think Paul and Barnabas are being presented a similar opportunity here. The crowd is already impressed. They can capitalize on this. Things could go well for them in some ways. And it probably could be easy to rationalize. You know, they could say to themselves, well, we know that it was the power of the true God. We'll urge them in that direction as we go along. You know, they're impressed by this. They're calling it the wrong thing, but we'll correct that in time. Right now, we can use that leverage to lead them in the right direction. They could have rationalized this away. Excited crowds are a great opportunity, but a poor measure of success. Paul would later write to Timothy. And he would write this after gaining wisdom through his missionary career, saying, the time is coming when people will not endure sound doctrine, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. It says people will gather around. You can gather a crowd by telling them what they want to hear, by satisfying the things that they would just love to hear you say, but it's not right. Sometimes you have to say the things that the people don't want to hear. You have to say the things that are best for them, but might step on toes, which is a hard lesson to learn for a preacher and a teacher. You may be wondering, like, what's he going to say now that he set that up? But yeah. We see this kind of thing all the time throughout history up to today, to see teachers of Scripture just saying, and really of other things too, but saying what people want to hear because people like to hear what they want to hear, and that gains a crowd, and that feels like success. It's a temptation for every preacher, for every teacher of Scripture, because larger crowds feel like job security. I can tell you. Larger crowds feel like job security, but the answer is, what good is a crowd, no matter how large, if you lead them in the wrong direction? What good is a large crowd? You're just taking more people down the wrong path. And so if we merely seek the praise of others, our pride will guide us down a path to idolatry. If all we're after is people saying, hey, I really like what you did, good job, we're in a dangerous place. Now, it's good if people, if we're doing the right thing and people like it and give affirmation to that, that's wonderful. But if that's what motivates us, we're in a dangerous territory. Some of you may experience this too. Every summer in my backyard and on my back porch, we have to deal with house flies coming up, especially if I'm grilling. Like, it drives me insane. And they can just get these swarms of flies. And every year I'm like, I'm going to figure out what to do to get rid of these things. And I try some different stuff. And if you have any ideas, by the way, let me know. But this year, I was annoyed by the flies. And I decided to get one of those fly traps that they're like a little bag, and you add water to it. It's got a horrible smell, and you hang it up, and the flies come into it, and they can't get out. So I hung one of those up in my backyard several weeks ago, and after just a few days, it smells like a rotting corpse in my backyard. But I go and I look, and there are flies like all over that bag, all going inside of it. And a few more days passed, and there's just tons of dead flies inside, and there's a layer that's literally this thick of just solid dead flies. Like, there's hundreds, probably thousands of flies. Everybody grossed out? You hungry for lunch? Okay. Thousands of dead flies in this thing, and I just kept thinking about that, like just these crowds, these swarms of flies just drawn to this thing, and yet it is death. Just drawn to this, and no matter how many flies, the more flies just encourage more flies to go check and see what's going on. I don't know if they think that way, but they go and they check and see what's going on. They want to get in on this too. But if we merely seek the praise of others to draw a crowd, our pride will guide us down a path to idolatry, which is death. What good is a crowd if we lead them in the wrong direction? Paul knew this, and so when the crowd started to gather and they started to honor Paul and Barnabas as Zeus and Hermes, and they started to gather up the sacrifices, and it dawns on them what's happening, because they may not speak the language, but they certainly recognize sacrifice. It dawns on them, and this is what happens. When the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments, and they rushed out into the crowd crying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them." And so they tear their garments, which indicates blasphemy, that they are perceiving a blasphemy is taking place, and that's how you respond. You tear your clothes, which their clothes would have been more valuable to them probably than many of ours, because they wouldn't have had nearly as many as we do. So they tear their clothes to indicate this blasphemy is taking place. And look what he says: we're not any different from you guys. Like, we're just men like you. We're not gods. This is not what this crowd wants to hear. They are offering them this great honor. They are trying to elevate them. And what Paul essentially does is insult their honor. This is tough words that he speaks here in this moment. But notice he says, "We bring you good news." which is to say the good news is something that we bring, not something that we are. He said, I am not the good news. I am not your Savior. I am not the one that you need to be worshiping, but I bring you good news. We aren't the heroes. We are the messengers, he says. We are not the heroes. We are the messengers. Something that we should consider ourselves. We, as a church, we are not the heroes for this world. We are the messengers, intended to point this world beyond ourselves, beyond this building, beyond this fellowship, beyond our meeting times, beyond everything that we do as a congregation. We point to the Christ that we embody. That is our mission. We are not the heroes. We are the messengers. And so we persistently point beyond ourselves, just like John the Baptist did. You remember John the Baptist, who had gained a following? He was preparing the way for the Messiah. And as soon as he recognized that the Messiah had arrived, he told his own followers, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And he sent them to go follow him. That was John's mission. That's what he did. And so Paul, basically, all of these things that they bring out to honor Paul and Barnabas, Paul says, I come to bring you a message to turn away from these vain things. These things that you consider honorable and worthy to present to who you think are gods, these vain things. It is a bit insulting to them, and they could take great offense at that. But Paul considers it worth offending people to point them to something greater, to point them to something greater than they ever imagined in the construct that they already have. He's pointing them to something greater, and he says about these vain things that he is pointing them to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. He lists out these things. These are all things that they would have thought of as made by different gods or ruled by different gods. And Paul is saying, no, it's not all of these. It's just the one that's over all of those things. And so Paul is pointing them to something better. We have to let go of the false gods that we want in order to see the God who is. We have to let go of the false gods that we want to see the God who is. You may want to say, well, I don't want any false gods. I think we do. I think sometimes we do. I think that we don't call them Zeus and Hermes. But there are false gods that we are drawn to give an improper place in our life. These people here in Lystra, they couldn't have it both ways. If they had held on to these ideas of Zeus and Hermes, if Paul and Barnabas had just let them hold on to that and just add in the message that they're preaching to, then they wouldn't be able to see it. It would obscure and color how they thought about Jesus. And everything would be wrecked. I'm going to come back to it in a moment, but I want you to keep thinking, what are the false gods that I want, that I need to let go of in order to see the God who is? Later, Paul would write a book called Galatians. Galatians is written to a group of churches that include this area that he's in this story. And so when he wrote to the Galatian churches, he said, formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not gods. And he goes on from there to express his frustration that they were drawn to go back to those old gods that they formerly had been enslaved to. He's frustrated with them turning back. In the passage that Tyler read for us a little while ago, Isaiah 45, 5 and 6, God says, I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me, that people may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. God has to constantly remind his people that he is the only one. He has to constantly remind his people of this because his people throughout history, from Israel all the way to the church today, God's people have it's not always been like, I want to eliminate this God to serve other gods. It's that I want this God and I want to add some things to it. I want to worship the one true God and also some other things. That's been the way that it has been, and it has been what the messages coming from God through the prophets and through the scriptures have been fighting against for centuries. So, what are the false gods that try to gain ground in our hearts? We can easily point to things like wealth, and power, or sexuality. What about things like comfort? What about gods that go by the name of safety? What about nationalism? What about seeking to be popular or gaining applause or always being right? Those are false gods. And sometimes we can be drawn to use those things to draw crowds, even as a church. We can draw a crowd for the wrong reason, and so we always have to be mindful of this and try to remind ourselves to turn from these vain things to serve the living God. And so Paul, after insulting the people and telling them to turn from their vain things to serve the living God, it says this, that even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. People are set in their ways. We are stubborn and also fickle, because the next verse says, Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, those are the places they had just left, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. So in a moment, they go from worshiping to becoming disillusioned to attempting to kill Paul. This takes quite a turn here, how quickly they turn on Paul once they see he's not what they hoped. They are blinded by their expectations from seeing and appreciating the truth. And they think he's dead. I mean, just imagine Paul's condition for them to believe that they killed him. Perhaps they brought him out and they began throwing stones, and one struck him upside the head, knocked him out cold. And he's in such a beaten and battered condition that they think, we're done. He's dead. Drag his body out. And they leave him out there for the animals to take. Imagine his condition that he is in. But Paul discovers here, not for the first and not for the last time, that it is costly to put the true God on display. It's costly because it necessarily tears down the false gods that we love to admire. The ones that we've internalized, the ones that we even build our identity on. The true God pulls those out and insults them. And that's costly. They're hard to let go of. Paul discovers this, as we said, it's costly to put the true God on display, but this was the plan for Paul from the beginning. If you recall, when he was converted on that road to Damascus, and God came to Ananias and told him to go meet up with this guy named Saul of Tarsus And Saul's like, Ananias is like, are you sure this guy is pretty dangerous? And God says this, the Lord said to Ananias, go, for Saul is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. This was the plan for Paul. And like I said, this incident wasn't the first and it won't be the last. In fact, if you go, and I encourage you to do this, we may read through it later in this series, but 2 Corinthians chapter 11, second half of that chapter sort of Paul lists out all of his sufferings, all the challenges that he faced, and it's a staggering list. One of the things he mentions is being stoned once, which we just read. It is a staggering list of things that he goes through, and it's incredible when you read all of that. It's incredible that he carried on, that he kept going, that he would pick himself up and do it again. He didn't give up. In fact, after being stoned and dragged out of the city in Lystra, when he woke up, he went back into the city. You know, some people, even in Scripture, some people will claim that Paul is insane. He even has to defend himself to that charge in some of his letters. People refer to Paul as insane, and it's not hard to understand why. In fact, he says, if we're out of our minds, then we're out of our minds for Christ, right? This is who he is. But why? Why does he do this? It's costly to put the true God on display, but Paul knew that life in his kingdom is worth the risk. It is absolutely costly, but it is worth the risk. Not only our home in God's kingdom after we leave this world, but the life we experience in his kingdom now is worth it. It is a blessing that outweighs the trouble that comes from living against the grain of this broken world. From here, Paul and Barnabas went on to Derbe, which is just a little further down the road from Lystra. And then they turned around and went back through where they had just been to make their way back to where they started. And it says this in verse 21. When they had preached the gospel to that city, that's Derbe, and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And so we see that even in this city where he was stoned and dragged out of the city, he goes back there to do what? To strengthen the souls of the disciples, which tells us what? That there were disciples in Lystra. Because of what Paul and Barnabas did there, they're enduring through that suffering, there were disciples. There was a church that was beginning to grow there in this place that had worshiped them as Zeus and Hermes. There was a burgeoning church. There were followers of Jesus who, even after Paul and Barnabas were gone, would continue to spread the gospel. And in fact, on every missionary journey that Luke tells us about, Paul goes back through Lystra. On every one of them. He makes his way back through this city to check up on those disciples. There's something happening here. Because Paul believed that showing them the truth was worth the cost. So, all that being said, let's clear the stage. That is to say, let's remove any false gods in our hearts and in the church. Let's refuse the temptation to make the good news about ourselves rather than the one who saved us. Let's lift up Jesus himself and believe his words that he will draw all people to him. Let's consider the cost and boldly proclaim, worth it.